Friends, it's an honor to be here at the invitation of Anis to give the first Dr. Narendra Dabolkar Memorial Lecture. I wouldn't say I'm happy to be here. This is because the grim circumstances that led to memorializing in an untimely way Dr. Dabolkar and other upstanding fighters for rationality, a scientific temper, free speech, social and economic justice, and a secular, democratic and progressive India. These circumstances should not have arisen in the first place, which is why we cannot be happy to hold a memorial lecture at this point of time. The list of the men, women and children who have met an unnatural and violent end in rising India in the 21st century at the hands of the forces of communalism, casteism and organized hate ideology and politics, this list is long and terrible. But let me mention here four who stood out for the clarity of their ideas and ideals, their unwavering commitment to these ideas and ideals, their integrity, the sincerity with which they put their words to action, and their fearlessness. Dr. Narendra Dabolkar, Govind Pansare, M.M. Kalburgi, and Gauri Lankesh. Each worked tirelessly for his or her ideas and causes in a different field, but some common threads ran through their lives, their work, and especially their unnatural death, in which we can detect a pattern. Which organization, which ideology, which set of conspirators and killers is involved is no secret. It never was. We are only learning the specifics, the details as the investigation into these cold-blooded assassinations that were meant to send a message of terror through society make their slow progress. Dr. Dabolkar was an extraordinary man. He lived his life, public as well as private, in harmony with his deeply thought out ideas on reason, on science, on philosophy, and on social justice. To say that he lived and died by his principles is to state the obvious. I have dipped into three of the books that are in English available in English translation, of course. The 2 volumes of The Case for Reason, the first offering an authoritative understanding of the anti-superstition movement, the second a scientific inquiry into belief. I've also dipped into Please Think, the practical guide to developing a scientific temper. I look forward to reading these books, or at least parts of them closely later on. Dr. Dabolkar's contribution in founding ANIS and in campaigning against and exposing all manner of exploitative superstitions, obscurantist beliefs and practices, and fraudulent claims of so-called miracle workers and healers is in the best tradition of the rationalist movement in India and abroad. Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra and Kerala have a leading role in this movement, and I can easily relate Dr. Dabolkar's work to the powerful and long-lasting contribution of Periyar Ramaswamy, who lived between 1879 and 1973, to rational thinking. In Periyar's case, he also wore his atheism on his sleeve, to gender equality, social justice, and self-respect in the land of the Tamils. As for bringing the killers and conspirators in the Dabolkar assassination case to justice, I read that the sustained protest to ensure an effective investigation and the legal battle to ensure transparency in the investigation have led to a significant development, with the CBI making several arrests. Still, given the national socio-political situation and the weaknesses and vices of India's criminal justice system, we must keep our fingers crossed about the eventual outcome of the investigation and prosecution of this vital case. In this connection, I also learned, and I particularly like to say it because my friend and somebody we greatly respect in the media, Mr. Pratap Pawar is here, that I've been told that there has been very important, timely and significant and also sustained support from all sections of the news media for the demand that the killers and conspirators must be brought to justice, that this must reach finality. And you can't say it in all cases that the media support is adequate, but in this case I've been told by the people directly involved that it has been quite splendid. The Marathi language media, Hindi language media, and the national media as well. And I think that is something we can feel reasonably happy about. So let me pay my personal tribute to the life and work of Dr. Dabolkar and express my solidarity with the campaign to ensure effective investigation and bring the killers and conspirators to justice before I move on to the main theme of my talk. 3 big challenges facing contemporary India. I don't think what I'm going to say is very new because we are perfectly familiar with it, but it will be useful to have a certain perspective on what these challenges are. The first is the challenge of mass poverty and deprivation, and I will deal with this relatively briefly, if only because there's a large literature, technical as well as more accessible, available on this subject. So, on the challenge of mass deprivation, the big question before us is whether 7 decades on, India has kept its tryst with destiny. In trying to answer this question, let us apply our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru's litmus test when he made his famous speech close to the midnight hour on August 14, 1947. And he said, Professor Amartya Sen has often quoted this, that this is an acid test of whether you kept your tryst with destiny. And this is the quote. The service of India means the service of the millions who suffer. It means the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. End quote. The path India took in 1947 was undoubtedly a brave experiment in trying to address underdevelopment and extreme deprivation in a large, highly populated, extremely poor country with a lot of rich country with poor people, India has often been described as. But within the framework of parliamentary democracy. But the experiment largely failed Nehru's litmus test of ending poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. What is worse, there is no indication that policymakers have lost much sleep over the palpable reality of India is by no means backward, by no means the most underdeveloped country. We are relatively developed in many respects, but there's no doubt that we have a greater mass of basic deprivations today than any other country on earth. What makes this particularly inexcusable is the failure of a relatively prolonged period of growth or even high growth substantially to scale down mass poverty and deprivation. There are endless debates on definitions of the poverty line, and successive central governments have claimed that they've been able to raise tens of millions of people above the poverty line. This is partly true. There's no doubt there's been progress, but the kind of success claimed in this area has been achieved, I believe, and more important, a lot of very competent economists have reinforced this, mostly through the manipulation of data, statistical sleight of hand. In any case, no one denies that the number of poor people in India runs into the hundreds of millions. But in meeting this first challenge, we need to go beyond how many hundreds of millions are below or around the minimally defined poverty line. We need to look at the challenge in terms of mass deprivations. Deprivation refers to the inability of individuals in a society to achieve what Amartya Sen and other economists call basic human functionings. Among these are the ability to live a long and healthy life, free from avoidable disease and hunger, and the opportunity to be educated and to have access to resources needed for a socially acceptable standard of living. Mass deprivation in India has many aspects, manifestations and consequences. There is income deprivation, there's nutrition deprivation, there's housing deprivation, there's education deprivation, there's health deprivation, there's gender deprivation, there's environmental deprivation, and deprivation of basic human rights, which I think many of us can now see is happening in the former state of Jammu and Kashmir. These are the major areas and they define the nature and scale of the challenge. Approaching this challenge positively, let us look to a stage going up to 2047, that is 100 years after India attained independence, but a stage that sees, in the first phase, that seeks to eliminate the worst forms of deprivation in the next 5 years. Can we take this for granted? The answer, I believe, is no, for the simple reason that the task calls for a state that is willing to mobilize and put to use the surpluses that are available to this end in a determined and concentrated way. This implies a growth strategy very different from what we see now. I don't want to go into the details, but the key question is, will the growth strategy change so that as a national priority we can bring an end to the state of multiple basic deprivations in which hundreds of millions of our people live. Other countries have done it. There are no guarantees, but what we need to do is to work to build public opinion and undertake democratic and progressive public action towards bringing about a suitable change in strategy. And that will mean figuring out what kind of institutional change is needed. It will mean joining the global search for an institutional framework that can deliver a more egalitarian and sustainable development strategy, a strategy that can deliver development with much less of its adverse externalities. The second challenge, which I think a lot of people are concerned about today, is the challenge to secular, democratic and pluralist India. This is a big question. I wish to address is probably, as I said, at the top of the minds of many people here. What kind of society are we building today? What is our idea of India? And has that idea changed for most Indians? Is a troubling question. This question has come to the fore at a time when majoritarianism is on the ascendant as one important victories in the popular arena, when communalism as a political mobilization strategy has made very disturbing and progress. It's no secret that this new dispensation is armed with an ideology and a socio-political program that are at odds with what we have been accustomed to for most of our independent career, most of India's independent career. It is important that when the leader of a major organization proclaims that India is a Hindu nation and that Hindutva is its identity, striking a blow at the secular concept of Indian citizenship and at the Constitution itself, he speaks for a very strong or even powerful constellation of forces. I don't want to go beyond that, since it is not necessary to do here, but I think this has to be put on the table when we talk about major challenges before India. Communalism as a political mobilization strategy has made disturbing progress over the past several years, feeding on the weaknesses, the vices, the corruption, the anti-people policies and the sheer incompetence of preceding governments. This has to be acknowledged. What is clear from the history of India over the past century and a half is that a wrong or unprincipled understanding of the problem of communalism in society and politics can lead to very tragic outcomes for very large numbers of people. We are talking about millions here. Communalism in the South Asian sense is, according to the historian Sarvapalli Gopal, unknown almost anywhere else in the world, and it is of relatively recent origin. Combated through the active and sustained practice of what the Constitution has mandated in independent India, the Republican Constitution that is, it could have been marginalized or at least contained. Yet it has been able, on account of a complexity of factors, to capture hearts and minds and occupy political center stage in the second decade of the 21st century. Let nobody be in any denial about this. Most of us believe it was going to be a fringe phenomenon. 10 years ago, it is no longer a fringe phenomenon, to state the obvious. The other question that arises is whether this process in society is temporary or is going to be long-lasting. At moments like the present, the apparent absence of capabilities within the political and constitutional system, the institutions themselves, to keep religious majoritarianism at bay, dispirits those who believe in secular democracy and modern civil society. But surely it won't do to accept any assessment or conclusion that suggests that the inevitability of the triumph of an authoritarian communalism over the progressive values of our freedom struggle, values that are embedded in our democratic and secular constitution. I'd like to think that given the strength of India's composite culture, its civilizational reserves, the wisdom of ordinary folk, the process being described above cannot be long-lasting. It is certainly not irreversible. It's fashionable today to decry secularism as a tired, formulaic, hack concept, and even some liberal journalists and other members of a supposedly liberal intelligentsia seem to have embraced this fashion. I think now is the time to take a clear-sighted stand on this question. There are many things going for secularism in India. Among them our history, our freedom struggle, and our constitution. But very often, I believe this also has to be registered. When Indians debate secularism at the intellectual or political level, the issue tends to get blurred or confused. The typical definition on offer in the Indian debate on secularism is Sarvadharma Samabhava, equal respect for all faiths, or Sarvadharma Sadbhava, good feelings towards all faiths. Over time, various leaders, including the philosopher-statesman Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, President Radhakrishnan, have offered interpretations of secularism that suggest that in the Indian context, it has a special, if not unique, meaning. Sometimes it's defined as religious toleration and Catholicity of outlook. Sometimes the celebrated statement of Swami Vivekananda in a Chicago address of 1893 is cited as the core of Indian secularism, and that statement is, that famous celebrated statement is, and I quote, "We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true," end quote. Such attempts at definition and clarification of a key concept in modern Indian history may have had their advantages and applications to particular gatherings or contexts, since they have the progressive effect of countering bigotry, intolerance, and fundamentalism in social life and communalism as a phenomenon. But intellectually and politically, I believe they will not do as an interpretation of secularism and what it demands. To put it in a different way, Sarvadharma Samabhava or Sadbhava is a necessary but insufficient condition for the flourishing of secularism in India. Let's list why. Secularism as a concept that must be put to work all the time consists of two robust principles. Many of you are familiar with them. The first is that people belonging to all faiths, all social sections, men as well as women, are absolutely equal before the Constitution, the law, and the state. There shall be no discrimination against anyone on grounds of religion, caste, race, ethnicity, language, and gender. This is what the Constitution of India mandates through several provisions. The constitutional guarantee of the special rights of religious and linguistic minorities is an extension of this equality and fairness principle. The abolition of untouchability and the exceptions to the non-discrimination rule made to safeguard what is known as compensatory discrimination in favor of the scheduled caste, the scheduled tribes, and also the socially and educationally backward classes are meant to be devices to secure the integration of historically disadvantaged people groups of people and their access to what is known as fair equality of opportunity. So this is the first principle, the equality and fairness principle. But to be meaningful, this principle must be based on justice if it is to survive and flourish. The unmet demand for justice in India has many dimensions: the constitutional, political, the social, the economic, gender, and so on. Discrimination and the denial of elementary justice in these dimensions weaken and sap the practice of secularism. The second principle of secularism is even more important in the present context, where major institutions are sought to be restructured. Although constitutionally and legally mandated, this principle, I believe, is honored mainly in the breach. This principle is that religion shall not be inducted into politics, that it shall not be exploited for political gain. The Constituent Assembly adopted a resolution in 1948 mandating this, and both the electoral and criminal laws are provisions in support of this principle. In March 1994, a 9-member bench of the Supreme Court of India full-throatedly upheld this principle in its judgment in what has come to be known as the Bombay case. It's important also to recognize that communalism in India is of diverse origin and content. It is not the monopoly of any one community. There is majority communalism and minority communalism, and they feed on each other. Jihadism, which used to be regarded as a fringe phenomenon, has come to center stage from time to time in recent decades. Often employing terror as a weapon, it has taken a heavy toll of human lives, livelihood, and welfare. And what is more, it strengthens the ideology of majoritarianism, majoritarian communalism. So the fight against communalism and religious fundamentalism, fanaticism, and extremism cannot be successful unless it is deeply rooted in reason and unless a scientific temper can be developed among the mass of the population. Communalism feeds on the most reactionary and harmful forms of superstition, obscurantism, pseudoscience, charlatanism, quackery, and hardcore criminality in religious guise. Even the Indian Science Congress has fallen victim to these obscurantist elements. It was not for nothing that Nobel laureate Professor Venki Ramakrishnan went on record to say, and I quote, this is from the Times of India, "I attended one day and very little science was discussed. It was a circus. I find that it's an organization where very little science is discussed. I will never attend another science congress in my life," he said. I don't have to elaborate on the critical importance of fighting obscurantism, superstition, and anti-science, because this is the aspect of the challenge that Dr. Dabolkar's writings and life work address tirelessly, effectively, and heroically. Finally, the challenge to free speech and freedom of the press. It is obvious that any campaign that makes a case for reason, science, democracy, the rule of law, and social and economic justice must give high priority to freedom of speech and expression and freedom of the press. By press we mean the entire news media, freedom of the press. Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech and expression, everybody knows that, as a fundamental right. This right, hard won in the freedom struggle against a highly repressive and censorious British Raj, is deemed to be unamendable thanks to the basic structure doctrine propounded by the Supreme Court of India. Freedom of the press is not explicitly mentioned in the Indian Constitution, but the Supreme Court has, through judicial interpretation, read it into Article 19. It has held that freedom of the press essentially is a combination of two freedoms: Article 19(1)(a), that is freedom of speech and expression, and Article 19(1)(g), the freedom to practice any profession or to carry on any occupation, trade, or business. The first is clearly the principal component. Unfortunately, in our experience, freedom of speech and expression is hemmed in and to a significant extent undone in practice by Article 19(2). This provides for restrictions on the fundamental right, restrictions prescribed by law, some reasonable, most of them, in my opinion, not reasonable. Notable among the unreasonable restrictions that remain on the statute book or in practice are the law of criminal defamation, the undefined power of contempt of court, uncodified legislative privilege, the law of sedition, 124A of the Indian Penal Code, other illiberal provisions of the IPC. In Tamil Nadu recently, 124, assaulting or overawing the governor has been used against Nakir and Gopal for articles published in a magazine called Nakir. So now the matter is before court, so I don't want to comment on it, but it's quite shocking for all of us that some articles were seen as tantamount to assaulting or overawing the governor so that he couldn't do any work, it said. Today it's clear that freedom of the press and more generally freedom of speech and expression are under pressure and in several cases under assault. I'll come to direct and violent assaults on freedom of the news media in a minute. But ordinary citizens find their fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression diminished, hampered and constrained by an overarching climate of fear and intimidation. Citizens making innocuous Facebook posts have been arrested, and even in this state, and even when they are given bail, find themselves facing criminal charges. The total information blackout and internet shutdown was imposed, I believe, in flagrant violation of Article 19 of the Indian Constitution on the entire population of the former state of Jammu and Kashmir for a prolonged period. We don't know how long this is going to last for the future, without the government even bothering to offer a serious explanation for why such extreme measures have been called for. In 2018, India ranked 128 from the bottom among 180 countries and territories, figuring in the annual World Press Freedom Index compiled by Reporters Without Frontiers, RSF, a Paris-based independent organization that dedicates itself to freedom of information. In a comparative reckoning, where the worst score was 88.87 and the best score was 7.63, India's score was 43.24, and you know what? The same as Pakistan's. But the bad news does not end here, stop here. The Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, which is based in New York, has after careful inquiry and strict verification documented the work-related killing of 1,350 journalists worldwide, including 50 in India since 1992. This was the year the New York-based, this independent non-profit organization, which was founded in 1981 to defend journalists worldwide from danger and the fear of reprisal, began to compile data on journalist fatalities across the world. Of the 50 killed in India since 1992, 35 were murdered in retribution for or to prevent news coverage or commentary. And I'm quoting from this CPJ report of the database. And the remaining 15 lost their lives while on dangerous missions or assignments or in crossfire. And the respected editor of Sadhana, Dr. Dabolkar, also figures in this list of journalists murdered. A breakdown of the subjects covered by the murdered Indian journalists is revealing. Politics 20, corruption 21, crime 11, human rights 8, culture 4, business 3, war 1. You know, some people cover both those, so there's an overlap. If you just add the numbers, it will exceed 35. These numbers add up to more because many of the targeted journalists have covered more than one subject. While no correlation can be detected between the murders and the government in place in the states and at the center between 1992 and 2018, it is significant that the overwhelming majority of the murders were committed against journalists reporting or investigating politics, crime and corruption. 3. Politics, crime, corruption. However, the CPJ's research does suggest that communal and other forms of divisive politics and social polarization across India have made the situation worse. 10 journalists were murdered across India over the decade beginning May 2004. For the 4 years beginning May 2014, have already seen the death toll rise by another 12. And it is not as though only defenseless local reporters working in remote locations, they are targeted. That's not just them, but the killers, experienced journalists, apart from Gauri, Shugat, Bukhari and other senior journalists have also been targeted and murdered. This suggests that now the problem here is when this starts to happen, you apprehend that journalist murders might be going through some process of deadly normalization, at least in some parts of our country. A special report by CPJ on India found that most of the murdered journalists were small, as I said, the small-town reporters who face much greater risk to their lives and limbs than their big city counterparts, but not just them. And this report also finds a weakness that there's a lack of media solidarity which adds to the problem, or at least adequate solidarity. In the case of Dr. Dabolkar, we heard otherwise, but in most of these cases, it's reported in the press, but there's no sustained campaign to keep this demand alive, that the killers and the conspirators must be brought to justice. The CPJ data, it's in the printed text in Marathi, so I won't go through that. What is as shocking as the rising number of journalist murders and the proliferating violence against them is the fact that the killers and assailants regularly go unpunished. By the way, many of these journalists who are murdered are first abducted and tortured before they are murdered, the majority of cases. Not only in India, but CPJ finds in many other countries. But coming back to this point, that they go unpunished. This impunity is a phenomenon witnessed not just in India, but in several other developing countries, where authoritarian rulers, typically elected and functioning under the cloak of democracy, they've been elected, and often genuinely elected. And extremist political movements are found at little time and tolerance for independent, especially investigative journalism. Investigative reporters are targeted as enemies of the state or of the party and of individual political leaders or of the extremist movement. And Islamic State is one of those which have targeted journalists, particularly elsewhere. Since 2008, CPJ, that is the Committee to Protect Journalists, has been publishing an annual Global Impunity Index. You can go to their website and study this. A quantified ranking of countries where journalists are murdered, the cases remain unsolved, and the killers go free. Killers and conspirators go free. In other words, the index is a graded indictment of countries where the rule of law does not seem to apply when journalists are murdered in the course of their work. We are not talking about some private murder resulting from some private feuds. They verify that all these journalists are being murdered in connection with their work. Not in some private matter, bad enough, but here it's purely journalists as journalists. And when the rule of law does not seem to apply when journalists are murdered in the course of their work. CPJ notes that in the past decade, at least 324 journalists have been silenced through murder worldwide, and in 85% of these cases, no perpetrators have been convicted. It is an emboldening message, they note, to those who seek to censor and control the media through direct violence. The 2018 index, and this is the most distressing thing here perhaps, apart from the murders. The 14 countries appearing in the 2018 index account for 82% of the unsolved murders of journalists worldwide for the decade. And guess what? India, along with 6 other countries, has figured in the Global Impunity Index every year over the decade. There's not been a single year where we got off that. So we can describe ourselves as a founding member, a permanent member of this club of shame. This has to be ended. I think I've said enough to give you an idea of the extent to which freedom of speech and expression and freedom of the press has been eroded, and the constitutional guarantee as well as the rule of law has been compromised in our country. I'm not entirely pessimistic. I think there are spaces, there is resistance, And you've seen that after the assassination of Dr. Dabolkar. There is strong resistance, there is sustained resistance, there are spaces, there are democratic spaces, there are people who believe in free speech and freedom of the press, and also what the press has to do also, its social responsibility. So we are not all is lost, but these are grim circumstances in which we function. Let me now conclude with a reminder that a lot of work awaits us in effectively meeting these three big challenges confronting India towards the end of the second decade of the 21st century. The challenge of mass deprivation, the challenge to secular, democratic and pluralist India, and the challenge to free speech and freedom of the news media, or freedom of the press. Dr. Dabolkar's life and work demonstrated, among other things, how these challenges are interconnected and how without